Thanks everyone for joining us today. For anyone who's new, I'm Elvia Limón. I am the engagement producer here at the Texas Tribune. And hi, Erin, thank you for joining us today. 2 weeks ago, I talked with the Tribune immigration and border security reporter Julian Aguilar about the chances for gun control measures in this year's session after Governor Greg Abbott stressed protections for gun owners, but made no mention of the 2019 mass shootings in his State of the State speech earlier this month. So if you missed that episode, you can still watch it in our Instagram TV section on our Texas Tribune account. For anyone who hasn't been watching our series, this is the Texas Legislature Explained, our Instagram Live series breaking down the biggest issues at the Texas Legislature. And before I introduce my guest, I want to thank Lone Star College and Texas State Technical College for presenting this episode. And now on to the topic of this week. I'm joined today by Erin Douglas. Erin reports on the environment for the Tribune from Houston. Previously, she was the business and economy reporter for the Houston Chronicle, and now Erin reports on climate change, nuclear waste, water supply for the state, environmental contamination, and most recently, last week's storm that left millions without power and water outages. If you have questions for Erin, I encourage you to ask them at the bottom of your screen in the chat function. But let's get started. So, Erin, in the wake of this devastating winter storm, people want to know how this happened. In short, how did we get here?
Yeah, so basically what happened is I want to actually go back to the fall when ERCOT, which is the grid manager for the state, we've all heard a lot about ERCOT over the last couple of weeks, but the ERCOT operators and their team and their managers, they all project how much power, supply, and demand we're going to have available for the winter peak. And so they do that back in November. They think that, okay, we expect to have this much demand during a winter storm, and we have like this much supply on the grid available during a winter storm. They also do the same thing during the summer. And so they forecast that, and then what happened was, weekend of Valentine's, President's Day weekend, what happens is we have this big storm hit the state, and people go back to their homes and they heat their homes, they turn the heat up, they're trying to stay warm. So we have demand at an all-time high going into the weekend. It outstripped what ERCOT had predicted. And then at the same time, in the early morning hours of February 15th, generation to the grid, the power generators that are supplying all the energy that we use start to drop offline. So plants start to trip, natural gas plants start to trip. ERCOT operators are in the grid room watching this happen and seeing the supply go down, 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 down at the same time as demand is going up, up, up. And so that's a really big problem because when you have an electricity grid, you have to keep it in balance all the time. Like supply has to be in balance with demand. And ERCOT has a margin that they sort of find acceptable on the grid. So we want, a little bit of excess supply as relative to demand. And as that margin gets narrower and narrower and narrower, then ERCOT has a certain level where they say, okay, we're going to do this emergency protocol. We're going to do this emergency protocol. Well, ERCOT ran through all of its emergency protocols in within a couple hours or less that night. And so what happens is the last emergency protocol that you have is to do controlled outages. And so these outages were supposed to only last a couple hours at a time for people. They were essentially supposed to roll. We've heard a lot about rolling outages. Well, they didn't roll. And so the reason that happened is because ERCOT said, okay, transmission utility companies, you have to cut this amount of power from your demand so that we can try to get demand and supply back in balance again. And unfortunately, ERCOT saw so much generation, that's the supply side, dropping offline, that they had to ask the utility companies that supply our homes to cut an enormous amount of power from the demand side. And all that the utility companies had left was to supply the critical infrastructure. And that's like, you can think of like hospitals or like certain aspects of our energy infrastructure that like have to be supplied. So that's why we weren't able to roll the outages. And that is what made this crisis so severe, is the huge amount of supply that dropped offline relative to the demand. I mean, ERCOT underestimated the demand and it overestimated the supply, but this is really a supply problem in this crisis, because there was really no room for the transmission utilities to switch from customer to customer and sort of like spread out this pain of outages like ERCOT had intended them to. And before I go any further, I want to also say that the reason why ERCOT couldn't wait and had to order these outages is because it's a certain level, like it is defined by like the rules of ERCOT and like the rules of like federal regulators. You get to a certain margin and you just have to like implement that protocol, because we know bad things happen if you get lower and lower. So if we had allowed the grid to go to an uncontrolled blackout situation, then that would have been really severe. I mean, this crisis was already very severe, you know, like dozens of people lost their lives. People were out of power for days. It was already quite severe. And so if ERCOT had allowed it to go any further than that and lost complete control of the grid, then, I mean, we could have been out of power for weeks, if not months, is what ERCOT officials have been saying.
Wow. So a lot of my friends have been learning a lot about the power grid in the last week, especially people who are not involved in reporting this. So can you go back a little bit and tell me who ERCOT is and just like why Texas was affected and other states weren't affected by this storm? You know, what's so unique about Texas?
Yeah, so ERCOT's the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, and they are actually a nonprofit entity. They're an independent entity separate from the government. And so the Public Utility Commission actually oversees ERCOT, and the Public Utility Commission is appointed by Governor Greg Abbott. So that's sort of how the regulatory structure works. As far as the grid, ERCOT is the Texas Interconnect System, and it covers most of the state. It doesn't cover 100% of the state, but it's most of it. And then there's, you know, some other major grids, the Northeast. Sorry, I've got some ambulances going by. We've got the Northeastern grid and the Western grid, and those grids are all much more interconnected. Texas has like a mostly independent power grid. It has a couple connections. There's some connections to Mexico and also to the Eastern seaboard grid, but they're pretty limited. And so that was actually a contributing factor during this crisis, because we weren't really able to get more help from our neighbors because we just didn't have the connections to do that. And that goes back in history, you know, decades ago, and even like the beginning of Texas electricity grid, when regulators in Texas basically didn't want to fall under federal regulation, and they tried to isolate Texas as much as possible. But I just think it is important to note also that we do have some connections outside, if not as many as other grids. The other major thing that has come into conversation in the last couple of weeks is what's called the deregulated structure of the electricity market in Texas. And that doesn't mean exactly what you think it means. It doesn't mean that there's fewer rules or anything like that. It means mostly that it's a market mechanism. So where in most markets, like I used to live in Colorado and New York, and you really pick from one power company, right? Like you sign up for your power and you select from the major utility. It's a monopoly effectively, right? In Texas, we have a bunch of different players on all ends of this. And so we've got some companies on the generation side, lots of different companies creating the power and the plants. And then we've got lots of companies supplying the power. And then we've got lots of retailers that you and I buy from, essentially do the transactions for us and bill us. And so it's a little bit of a different market structure, and it makes it so that all the companies are quite competitive in Texas, and that has come under criticism for a variety of reasons that we can get into later if you want.
Well, yeah. So I just want to know who are the major players here, because there's been a lot of emphasis on ERCOT, but are they really the main source of the blame? What about the other pieces of the puzzle? You mentioned the structure of how ERCOT is, a nonprofit and it's oversaw by other players. So who's really to blame here? Or, what have you seen in your reporting?
Right. So this has been a big topic in the legislature during the House and Senate hearings the last couple of days. And it's tough because there's a lot of different entities touching this system, right? And so ERCOT is sort of taking a lot of the fall for this. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but they are. I mean, the job is to operate and manage the grid reliably. They didn't do that. So I understand why people are like very upset, and legislators are taking a hard look at them, and they should. However, I mean, ERCOT's just one piece of the puzzle here. Like, ERCOT is one entity, and then you've got the Public Utility Commission above them, and then you've got all the generation. Like I mentioned, this was a supply side issue mostly. And so you've got all these power generators who are supposed to be producing electricity and supplying it to the market. And their stuff started to trip offline because they weren't winterized, is what we're calling it, but they essentially weren't prepared for the cold that we saw. And then we also had problems with just getting natural gas supply to those plants to run. I mean, we mostly run on natural gas during the winter in Texas. And so we have problems on the production end because we had winter and weather problems with natural gas producers not being able to get their natural gas to the plant. And that process is regulated by the Railroad Commission of Texas, which is another regulatory body here. And so they regulate, contrary to the name, they regulate oil and natural gas production mostly. They also regulate some transportation aspects of that, like the pipelines. And so they're also a big player in this. And I mean, the commissioner testified yesterday, and she was mostly talking about the outages that went to the oil field, and some of the power was cut to natural gas aspects of the system. So the compressor stations or the wellheads of the field, like we lost power along this supply chain when the outages were ordered. And when that happened, that even further limited the amount of natural gas that we had to run the power plants that we need to generate electricity. So there's a lot of different players in this. I mean, and we haven't even talked about the utility companies yet, which are regulated by the Public Utility Commission. And so they transport all the power that is generated by the power plants. They then move it into our homes. And so they're also facing some criticism as well, and testified yesterday.
So you mentioned about winterization and just Texas not being prepared for this type of storm. And I'm from North Texas, so we do see ice occasionally, but it will be only like in North Texas, and Austin will be fine. So what is Texas doing in the legislature to make sure that these plants do get winterized and everything is set up so that this doesn't happen again?
Right. I think that's going to be a big topic of conversation, but it was interesting watching the hearings yesterday because you listen to the power generation companies and they're like, well, we were prepared for the storm, but we weren't prepared for this amount of supply to be to drop off, and we they're essentially saying that, like, we don't necessarily need to winterize, we just need better communication, or we need different aspects. Like the natural gas producers, they were essentially saying that they were ready for the storm, but then that they lost power to their sites. And so it's just a tangled up problem, and it seems like nobody wants to talk about like how much it's going to cost to winterize all of the infrastructure, because it would be very expensive and it would be quite challenging. And so I mean, I think that everything is on the table right now for legislators. They're really looking at everything, but as far as like what is actually going to be done, I mean, that, you know, clearly remains to be seen. I think it'll be interesting to see what legislators actually end up requiring.
And what about experts? I mean, have they said anything about what the state would need to do in order for this to never happen again? I know that the winter storm was historic and, you know, something that we hadn't seen before, but if it does happen again, what are experts recommending that Texas do?
Yeah. So I've been talking to a lot of like energy analysts and like different policy experts who have looked at this. And I mean, so 10 years ago, 2011, y'all have probably heard about this a little bit, but there was not a similar storm, but there was a severe winter storm, February 2011, and we ended up implementing outages during that time as well, and they weren't as severe. It was much less generation came offline during that storm than in the storm that we just experienced. But I would say that a lot of those policy recommendations that came from the federal government after there was like a federal report produced from it were not fully implemented. And so one of the recommendations was, you know, more winterizing of the infrastructure, and Texas never required that. It was considered in the aftermath of that storm, but it was never really implemented. And so what ERCOT and the power generation companies say is that there was some winterizing that happened in the aftermath of that storm. And there's some more checks, like ERCOT will do spot checks on winterization protocols and weatherization, and they have to submit plans and stuff like that, but it's not required broadly, if that makes sense. And so that's something that I think legislators are going to look at. Another problem I think that they're looking at is there's been a lot of complaint about the communication that was given out to the public. So that'll be a big topic of concern, trying to figure out how we can effectively communicate to people if they're about to lose power for that many days. I mean, I think the problem in this situation was that you have to make these decisions from the ERCOT grid operator's perspective in real time, because at any point, if you lost your margin of supply available to you on the grid that you need in order to balance with demand, then you could be in an uncontrolled blackout situation. And so ERCOT just wasn't expecting that much generation to come offline. And so that's really what we have to figure out, is why did so much generation come offline all at once? And then it stayed that high. Like ERCOT showed a graph at a board meeting the other day that showed that, you know, we lost like 48%, give or take, of our generation capacity on the grid. And that's a lot. That's like as much power as we can generate. We lost nearly half of that, and stayed very high like that for several days because we were having trouble getting the generators to connect back, or like you'd connect back and then they'd lose their natural gas supply and they'd have to go offline again, or you'd get back and then you'd have like some other problem and you'd have to go back offline. And so the net effect was that people were stuck in this situation just for days. And so I think the third thing that legislators are going to take a hard look at, you know, other than the natural gas production, the generation, the communication, is also how can we effectively make sure that the utility companies that were in charge of implementing the outages have enough room to be able to roll the outages. Because I mean, I don't think people wouldn't have been upset. I mean, they would have been upset. It would have been inconvenient if they had been out of power for a couple hours at a time. But we were without power for days at a time, and that creates a crisis situation, right? And so somehow effectively making sure that these utilities have enough room to move around the outages would have helped a lot, and making sure that those utilities know which infrastructure is truly critical, because that was part of the problem, right? Is we cut power to natural gas producers who then couldn't supply the plant because they didn't have power to send the fuel to the power generators. So yeah, there's just a lot of different moving parts, but those are definitely like three areas that I see is winterizing, communication, making sure we have the supply available, and making sure that we know what is critical infrastructure and what is not.
So on the communication end, I want to ask you this question because Tim Sullivan, 1964 in the chat is actually asking this, and I'm also curious why, we didn't use existing notification systems for notifying people what was going on. Because a lot of us just didn't know what was going on. We didn't know if we were going to get the power back that day or if we needed to wait the next couple of days. And he asked, why didn't we use similar forms of communication similar to Houston's hurricane preparedness tools? Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's been a huge area of criticism. I mean, throughout these hearings is just that we didn't warn people. We didn't warn people as if it were a coming hurricane that you needed to go stock up or you needed to get out of the area or something, right? So that is definitely something that legislators are looking at. I think that part of the problem here was that this was truly unprecedented in the sense that ERCOT didn't know that the amount of supply, or I guess the amount of demand that they were asking transmission utility companies to take off was going to put those companies in a position where they couldn't roll the outages around, like I mentioned earlier. So if you're asking them to take off that much power supply, they're just stuck in this position where they can't switch it around to different people. So if it had gone according to plan, which obviously it didn't, then we wouldn't have needed such emergency notifications to the public. It became this crisis because we were so constrained in the amount of generation that we had available.
That makes sense. Well, we're talking about the legislature and everything that you're following. So if viewers and are interested in following this, what can they do to see what's going on in the legislature related to the winter storm and the outages?
Definitely. So we're streaming it on our site. We also have lots of coverage, not just me, but we also have an energy reporter, and we have different reporters that are helping out on this. And so definitely following our reporters, following our coverage. We also have a database for your lawmakers, so you can look up who your lawmaker is in your area and then contact them if you want to provide input on any of these hearings. And then I know that they're taking public comment too, so that's always a good thing to do if you're concerned about the situation or if you want them to address a certain thing.
And how can people follow you? Can they follow you on Twitter?
Yes, Twitter is best. My username is Erin M. Douglas23. Pretty active on Twitter, and of course y'all can always email me too. I try to stay on top of my email, but it's been quite the wild ride recently, so yeah. I apologize.
No, it's fine. With that, we're out of time, unfortunately. I mean, this is something that's going to continue to be a topic of conversation, so we'll keep talking about this. I want to thank you, Erin, for joining us and for answering our questions. I mean, we still have so many more, but we'll continue reporting on all the hearings and everything that's going on. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today on Instagram Live. And for more coverage and resources on how to follow the storm and just follow everything that has come out of the storm, go to texastribune.org. We also have our reporter Mitchell Furman joining our Facebook group for an AMA on Wednesday, and he's going to be answering questions related to the storm and everything that's going on in the legislature. So if you didn't get your questions answered today because we have a limited amount of time, we will have a whole hour on Wednesday starting at noon. Our Facebook group is This Is Your Texas, and we'll post this on our Twitter accounts and social media accounts too. But go ask Mitchell a question on Wednesday. So thank you so much, Erin, and thank everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Have a good day.